here. And we shall go live, and let's start. Well, welcome. Absolutely delighted to be here and in your company today. This particular webinar really gets to joining up quite a bit of the thinking that we've been talking about in the previous 4 episodes of this century thinking. And what we've got really is looking at how we then count value and how we can, perhaps look at a better framework that we can bring into consideration about valuing, counting value. But perhaps before we get into the serious stuff, one of the things that we have absolutely enjoyed in our family, and then it's been a gift really of COVID coming along, is that we meet in a virtual family dinner, 4 locations in Adelaide, 2 locations here in Sunbury because we're not allowed to get together, and my brother there in Stawell every Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And whereas typically dinner itself is over with in about 20 minutes, by the time the hungry grandchildren have gotten through their meals, the conversation just goes on for 2 hours, 2.5 hours frequently. And it's just a stunning time to get together. And this week, I just happened to be mentioning that I'd been speaking about, that I'd been enjoying David Attenborough's Netflix documentary of A Life on a Planet, his witness statement to his life, and really how powerful I found that. And that, yes, it spends about an hour cataloging humanity's impact on life on this planet, but then spends about half an hour going through his view on how to do things better, that there is hope, and really focusing on biodiversity as being the answer to addressing climate change, because everything's connected. And in the midst of that, my brother, David, says, mate, we're fighting 2 diseases here. One's COVID and the other's stupidity. Oh, mate, we can't fix stupid. He says, no, you can't. But Charles Darwin wrote a book about it. And he's right, he did. And if I can just get an extract from Charles Darwin, he said that really, well, he presented his book as one long argument, but the one thread, and that is not about the survival of the fittest, it's about the ones that are most responsive to change. And I think that then really cuts to the heart of us as humans. How responsive to change are we? And I'd like to pull that thread on how we count value and try and change the way and think about how we can change the way more responsibly to change. And just looking at that picture, I've got to feel I've got to get my beard a bit longer, maybe. Now, David Attenborough doesn't talk about sustainable development. Now, I know there's been a lot in the United Nations and everything else about sustainable development. What he's talking about is that we rewild the planet, that nature knows how to fix this. Just give it space and time, and remarkably quickly, we will see things change. You know, he was standing there. For those of you who've seen it, you might, you know, be just amazed at what's happening in Chernobyl, you know, from 25 years ago. And he says the forests are taking over again. So we just need to give nature a chance. And then there's Charles Massey, who's a farmer out in southeast New South Wales, hard country outside of Cooma and all of that, and 30 years of dry, dusty paddocks. And then he said, no, we just can't keep farming this way. And he's looked at how we can regenerate, and regenerative farming has really taken off. And you know, his book here is something that's really getting global attention, The Call of the Reed Warbler, for how indeed we can start to rewild the world from the soil up. And because that feeds into the food chains, which feeds into our health and the way in which we think and act in this world. So lots of lessons there. It's magic. So when we come back to the model that we've been talking through, then we've looked a bit about how value is conceived. We thought a bit last time about how it's contributed, and this time how it's counted. But in order to be able to do that properly, I need to be able to, you know, recap in a few areas. And last time we talked about, but how do we help people shift in the way in which we look at how value is contributed? And we talked a bit about the work of Daniel Kahneman, right? And then what Nicholas Taleb had actually learned from Daniel Kahneman, and it was this. So Kahneman had said that people don't perceive standalone objects, right? But rather differences from the anchor point. Well, absolutely super. But the real thread of that from Taleb's point of view was, hey, shift the anchor point. And then maybe we can, in fact, in Taleb's own words, we can force people to have a healthy outlook. Imagine that. Imagine that. Well, the current anchor's pretty crap, right? Economic led. People are really almost seen as human resources, and the planet again is something that is a contributory resource that's again interpreted back in dollar terms as far as we're concerned. That's really what we're trying to shift from, to something that's more ecology-led, so more life-centered design. And that's what we talked about last time, was how indeed we can look at shifting the anchor to that. And a key element of that is to really shift it towards an ecological point of view, of asking first what it is that we're seeking to achieve by way of outcome. And then whether or not that actually, you know, we can act without doing harm to either people or the planet. And from that process, make the money in the process. And we said that one of the things that is really crucial to help people stay attuned to that social outcome and the social good that they want to do is to have one question that becomes the anchor point for all decision making. So, and that was critical, and we explored that last time with an example. And now we ask, given that, and which measures matter? Well, actually, I'd rather frame that as, how do we frame the measures that matter? I think that's probably the better question than the one I've put here. So where do we start? Well, we start where we started in episode 1 of this, in realizing that in taking a holistic view, it's bloody hard, right? Because we've got a world imbued with analysis, that critical thinking, critical analysis, the breaking down of thought structures is the way in which we then learn about the parts in order to learn about the whole. and we know where that goes, right? So that the whole framework of hierarchy, control, and solution orientation is not wrong, but it's not sufficient on its own. That being structurally divisible is the easy part. The hard part is on the right, doing the synthesis. And no one really teaches this, eh? It's functionally indivisible, that the whole is the whole, and that we need to think about the system that we want to behave differently and how that lives in a larger system, right? And given that, then, what are the changes we can make in the larger system that influence our behavior? And it's that emergence of behavior change that is crucial. And we achieve that not so much through control, but actually through communication that enables control over the behavior, right? And that instead of being solution oriented, we become much more interventionist and looking, planning is absolutely crucial. Not the solution or the plan that sits on the left, but the planning as a process, because planning as a process is processes of communication that allows emergence to happen. So let's take these two ideas and try and bring them into a management frame. And this is the first time I've exposed this thinking, basically because I only built this over the last week as I have been thinking about how to bring all of these different ideas together. So, I welcome your questions at the end of this to really grill into it. But let's see how we go. Now, in terms of things that are being structurally divisible, I look to a man, Professor Kenneth Balding, and he lived from 1910 to 1993. He was a British man in America, and he was absolutely brilliant. But and one of these quotes here, is just right for the time. It wasn't right at the end of the 80s because everything was about growth in the 80s. But here we are today, battling in a finite world, trying to, yes, deal with an economic crisis. Yeah. And one might ask whether or not the treasurer is a madman or an economist. And anyone else who thinks that exponential growth is what we should be seeking again in an economic context. And that is one of our challenges, is that society has been imbued with this concept of exponential growth. And all of the measurement systems that we've put in place have driven us to this, right? So what can we do about it? So Kenneth, he didn't get a Nobel Prize, but by jingo, his work was up there, and he was nominated at different times, both in economics and peace, because he was a pacifist as well, a Quaker, and they gave a wonderful lecture in Melbourne at one time now. And I won't go into that now, but if anyone wants his thoughts on Quakerism in the context of the natural science and the natural world, there's some absolutely wonderful ideas that he puts forward in that domain. But let's go back more to his economic thinking. And one of his most wonderful but least used pieces of thinking is his hierarchy of systems complexity, right? And here it is, a hierarchy of metaphors. So in many ways, one can look at this, excuse me, and see just how one goes from the simple description at the framework level to thinking of systems that then move through predefined mechanical movement, those then that are much more dynamic, cybernetic even, but operating within limits, you know, thermostatically. But that's a metaphor, right? And we can look at all sorts of systems that work within that. And that's about the limit of the closed systems, right? So that we can get to, and that's about the limits by and large of physics. So that when people talk about in the social domain, hey, it's not rocket science. Well, they're right. It's not. It's about, you know, social domains about 5 orders of magnitude more complex than rocket science. So, I invite you to challenge people every time you hear that. Rocket science sort of runs out at around about level 3 in systems complexity. And then at level 4, we get into the open systems, and you can think of the cell and how it stays viable, and it takes and gives from the environment that it lives within. And then you can get multiples of cells, and those like plants, and these are the systems with sort of blueprinted growth. And we know what a carnation will grow up into and what it broadly will look like. Then you can get systems of systems that then have sentience. And these are the animals, the sentient beings that are aware of their environment. Then the human. Now, the real difference with the human as we get up into the next tranche of systems complexity is that we are aware that we are aware. And the way in which information, if you notice, the processing of information gets more complex, because at the human level, we now process information by way of symbols and belief systems and so on. Now we get into social systems, and these are the ones that we really want to impact, right? Because it's social systems that are the larger system that we operate within. And it's the social systems that we want to change in order to get the behavior change at the humanity level. And the unit of interest at the social level is the role. The role that we engage in, and we can have many roles in life. And finally, at the system 9, and in Balding's, he put this in more enough for completeness. And for him, this was about the system of knowns, of unknowns and unknowables. But within that, we can look at it as, but isn't that what strategic planning's about? We're trying to make sense of a future that we don't really understand, but yet we're giving some pointers towards. Super. So what I did with that about 20 years ago, nearly, and I was working in the defense context, so that my social strata that I was interested in was warfare. But okay, take warfare out and plug in your system of interest, whether or not it's health or education or what have you, doesn't matter. All the rest remains true. How do you think about strategy of the unknowns and unknowables, the roles and authorities that you're going to allocate across the system? And this becomes, of course, the structurally divisible part. But then you get the competence, self-awareness, situational awareness. That's not structurally divisible. And it's when it becomes structurally divisible that we get into problems of the left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing, right? This is a functionally indivisible component of our social systems. Same as our business processes. Those things that they don't leave when the bloody light goes out. No. And all of the focus on equipment and technology, down the bottom end, that's the rocket science stuff, right? And that's the stuff when they really don't want to deal with the human behavior, they'll say, well, why don't we actually go and look at how our systems themselves are organized? And you can see that that is leadership procrastination when that sort of conversation emerges. This is a quote from Balding's paper, and I've put it out there because I think it's the most significant thing about measurement systems, right? Is that his hierarchy of systems complexity should prevent us from accepting a level of analysis below the level of the world which we're investigating. And so often we do. And that paper, if you're interested in it, is online and freely available. And the reference is there. So let's go back to the beginnings of that measurement framework. And that we know that as humans, for us to synthesize a better world, then we've got to look at how we shape and influence and intervene in the social systems and beyond for us as humans to create a world that is better than what we've done. What we've learnt is that in those first three categories of systems complexity, you can actually, look at things in a fairly unitary way. Fairly linear thinking sort of works okay down there, if that's where you're working. And if that's the level of analysis, right? If you're cutting code, if you're writing anatomy papers and the like, you're down there and you've got to be quite absolute, right? And we really need that. We've got to know what we know and what truths we can hold as true and be quite unitary about that. But when we get up into the other domains where things are in an open system and not as complex as having, humans involved so much, but the design of business processes, then we need to be much more adaptive in the methods that we take. Once we get up to where the information is dealing with symbols and belief systems and interpreting systems of complexity that's more complex than us that are intervening in them, then interpretive approaches are the only way to go. And the reality then is that any intervention in the social systems needs to have a mix of interpretive, adaptive, and unitary approaches. Otherwise, it'll be incomplete. And as we learned from Hofstede, is that we must also accept that whilst that, a lot of people love the idea of clarity, clarity exists at a unitary level. But the knowledge when we're dealing at the social systems level will always be subjective, tentative, and partial. And we need to accept this within our measurement frame. But if we not only accept that, but also, act in an adaptive manner, then we can change the measures within the frame as the context changes, or as our knowledge at the lower level changes to say, hey, that is no longer true, that assumption no longer holds, then we can be adaptive in the measures that we change within the framework. And so, what I'm building here is a framework within which we can place our measures within context. And as we work with subjective, tentative, and partial knowledge, then we're dealing with three different currencies, right? We've got unitary approaches where the currency is calculation. We've got adaptive approaches where our currency is experience. And that was really the whole thing of the master apprentice. The building of cathedrals all happened at that level. And then as we're now dealing with highly complex systems and interpretive approaches, then the currency is judgment. But just as we see with some premiers saying, hey, my judgment was wrong on that day and I'll change it, we've got to be able to tolerate people getting it wrong. It happens. It's just whether or not, when they know it's wrong, they do something about it, right? Good. So there's different classes or different foci for each group of measures that we might put into place. And they're known as the 5 E's. And this comes from Professor Peter Checkland. And Peter wrote the book, Systems Thinking, Systems Practice. And I'll start from the top and work down. The reality of today's world is that they start at the bottom and then largely ignore the rest. And that is part of the anchor that we're seeking to change. So, in the world of unknowns and unknowables, I guess our question is, are we doing what's right? And that's contextual, right? And if it's right, then are we doing it well? That's the effectiveness thing, but the effectiveness has a long-term dimension to it. And then given that we're doing the right thing, doing it well, are we doing it in a way that will not cause harm to others? And that's the ethics question. And as we've discussed in previous webinars, of course, one could ask whether or not the global financial crisis really was a financial crisis or a global ethics crisis. And I think that's really where it fell down, right? Now, aesthetics. Well, is it about how things look? To some degree, that's true. If you want to sell a truck to the army, paint it green. Now, that's a trite example. What's a much more meaningful use of the aesthetics frame is to think about the values that are being practiced as your ethical representation and what people actually see of the leader in the organization. Because if what you see and if what you say is not what people see, then your leadership is on thin ice, right? We know this. And we've all witnessed it, I'm sure, certainly I have many times in my 50 years in large organizations. And then, of course, when we get down to the lower levels of complexity with unitary approaches, yes, we can talk about waste and how, how much redundancy is enough, and get things working efficiently. So those are the classes of measures that we might then look at. And I just need to drag myself down a little there. So how do we realize this? Well, from an efficacy point of view, it comes down to, so what's the outcome that we're actually driving for in our social intervention? Then, to be effective in that social intervention, what's the one question that's going to drive our focus, right? And you remember, of course, this one question was made all the more popular by the British rowing team in its quest for gold in 2000 Olympics, when they said, the one question is, will it make the boat go faster? And that drove all of their decision making and their behavior, right? Then in terms of the aesthetics, as the leader, showing care in the values being espoused versus the behavior being demonstrated. And that can be really hard at times, but we know that if there's 1,000 people in our organization, there's 1,000 people carefully watching the alignment between what we say and what we do. And that is the thing we need to be most careful of. And then at the lowest level, are we connecting the measures that we're using in a meaningful way? Or are we just counting because it's countable? So there's the frame. And really, it's all got to come together systemically, right? As we intervene at the social level, the outcome, the questions, the values that we espouse, etc., all need to come together. And how do we then help to regenerate our measurement frames so that indeed we do get a more holistic, integrated outcome in the process? Well, let's look at where it's failed. Well, to start with is that there's been huge focus. In fact, all measurement systems I've seen almost start and finish at this level. You know, they're smart and so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Yes, okay, super, okay. And that means that you're creating something that you can count and not asking yourself whether or not it really matters, and the connection up. And so that breaks the connections that occur. And we see that with the triple bottom line as well, right? Anything from the planet, well, the planet's just seen as one big resource that we could just pull in, and how we use those planetary resources for economic value. How people are labeled as human resources. And as soon as you see people being labeled as human resources, you know that the focus is down at the bottom line. And there's only one real connection, and that is to profit. And we've seen that in the aged care sector here in Australia, right? Where, and in the banking sector and in many others, that it's profit first. In the aged care, you know, bleed them dry before we die. And it's a disease, but it's something that we can shift if we shift the anchor to a management framework, a measurement framework. At the next level up, what's happening is that it's all about financial incentives which drive self-interest, right? And the care is broken. So once again, the interdependencies that are so crucial in a holistic system become broken. And we've never, you know, the biggest disappointment, I think, with the Hayne Royal Commission was that, and it's on about page 335 or thereabouts, he explicitly connects remuneration with value, because he says remuneration tells the people in the organization what the organization values. And there was a ripe opportunity there to actually change the anchor, but no, he buried it further in the mud. And this is one anchor that really needs to be lifted and changed. And from that, then maybe we will get more care. And then at the highest level, well, what drives, you know, corporate law? It's a focus on return on shareholders, and so profit focus. Yes, of course. Well, given that, why outsource aged care to profit-based companies? You know, because as I witnessed in you know, a general manager in a global corporate myself, Richard, you need to take more cost out of your business. And you go, what? And frankly, if I could have made money painting manhole covers, it might have been okay. You know, it was driving towards shareholder earnings. Why? The CEO's own financial incentive was that if he hit the earnings per share targets, then he got 10 times his annual salary as a bonus every year. And that's happening time and time again throughout the major corporates of this enterprise. And we saw it last time. You know, CEOs in the last 40 years, their salaries have and remuneration has grown, you know, over 1,000%. Even the very high earners have done exceptionally well at 300% real growth, where the typical worker in 40 years has had 12% real growth. And that's from the American Economic Productivity Institute. So how do we make it work? How do we regenerate this system? Well, know what we're about and settle the outcome and the focus question. But more than anything else, how we put our values that we talked about two webinars ago into action is absolutely crucial. And the measurement systems that don't focus on values, then don't focus on these behaviors, and making sure that, and it could be simple things to do. One consulting business that I was in fact, I'm still a partner in, what we did was not only set the values, but then have spotters, right? And that I would spot with someone else. So it's almost like a focus friend in some way, shape or form, and just notice when behavior didn't quite align with the value set. And you go, you know what? And pull it up every single time and just enable and empower those conversations that sort of says, come on, this is what's driving the business. It's how we behave as one and individually that actually puts our values into practice and builds the business from there. So how we show care about that is absolutely crucial. And then empower the people to make the connections, empower the people to care. Now, I've just given you that one example, but allowing them to connect dots that you don't see need connecting, and to give them the freedom to experiment, right? Now, I can talk about empowerment, but if we don't have the conversations about how power itself is allocated and used, then empowerment is another one of those cliched, you know, HR type things, when really empowerment of people, which is so crucial, needs the conversation around power and how it is allocated and how it is executed and used. And of course, that goes to Argyris's double loop learning, which is so bloody crucial in the mix of this. And I don't have time to go into Argyris's work there, but he was from the Harvard Business School, and his papers around about 93 and 94 are relevant, and his really ties into control through communication that finishes up with the ability to change the governing values if that is what is required according to the changes in the context. And these are critical within the measurement systems. And then finally, how we measure progress, not profit, progress, with a view to overcoming the inequalities. And that's building the connection across all relevant parts, not just the parts that we can see. It's, you know, getting to understand the mortar as well as the bricks. As I say, everything's connected, and this was my father's ship, and of course it's a wonderful metaphor, because as a ship goes to sea, it is effectively effectively a small town with all the functionality of a small town. And if people don't understand how it's all connected, then things break down very quickly. So we change the anchor, we need to change the measures. If we create a measurement framework that has the economy within it, but is driven from our planetary and social concerns, then how we set our outcomes, how we devise our questions that lead our interventions, then we will build the measurement frameworks that hang together holistically in this sort of framework. So, and we will get to valuing the whole counting of value and being really quite adaptive as we do that, and hopefully regenerate value, so that for any one of us, the values where we first learn them, with our mothers and fathers and grandparents, and we practice them in our families, can also live true in how we enter our communities, businesses, whether that's at the national or global levels, it doesn't matter. It's that congruence and authenticity that's absolutely crucial in this. So with apologies to Charles Darwin, I offer this minor change when we think about measurement systems and frameworks of measures. It's not the strongest of measures that survive, and typically the strongest have been those that we can count, right? But the ones that are most responsive to change within a framework that is structurally divisible and functionally indivisible, because that's holism. And then as we practice this, we code it onto the DNA of ourselves. Well, it's already on ourselves, but bring that into our organizations and code every strand of the DNA of our organizations. So that's my presentation on the value framework. And that is a gateway, as we finished in the blue circle on value, to then move on in the next series of webinars where we'll be talking about viability. So if we understand really what we want most and what we value most in life, then how do we, build and maintain organizations that are viable? And viability goes to the essence of life. It's the science of life in many ways. And then in the third series, we'll tie together, well, okay, now what's the leadership that we can show as individuals and organizationally that'll then tie value and viability? It'll be like that chemical bond that keeps these things holistic and tied together. And that's where we're going in the next series. So, as ever, I am deeply obsessed about the next generation leadership and governance, because it really is the choices that we make now and how we build systems that share power and empower our people. And in the process, unify our political, social, and technological aims, right? It's the unification of these things that achieve ultimately the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, that we can conceive of how we regenerate and which we have to do before sustainability becomes a part of it. And yes, Michelle, I'm still writing. And now, because I have indeed had 6 false starts at writing a book, but that is coming along, and these webinars are part of the process. If anyone would love to inquire further about teachings that I can give either in the systems thinking itself or the leadership, or engage in mentoring, I have a few spots open if anyone's interested in that. And of course, the last time I spoke, this book came out, and it's just been unbelievable that it achieved a #1 status in about 7 or 8 business and management categories. And at one time, got as high as #11 in all of Amazon's digital content, which includes about 3.8 million titles out there. So we were absolutely delighted with how this book came together, with 18 points of view from the systems point of view, and much of the thinking that I've covered today or some of the thinking I've covered today is in there. But then, people here talking from mental health, from psychology, from kindness, and a whole range of disciplines that help give us the multiple perspectives we might need to see what opportunities we have for advancing the world. So if we're not already connected, and I think we all are now, let's connect. And perhaps just in closing, I say thank you, but I'd love to open the mic now and invite any questions or comments, or how do you feel about that? Too complex, a lot to get your head around.
Hi, Richard. It's Liam. I'll talk, give you a chance to get some water in as well. As usual, amazing stuff. And yes, it was a lot. I'm going to go away, right, and let that bounce around my head for a week. And that was really helpful. One question I had for you that sparked in my brain while you were talking was, sometimes this stuff can come across as challenging people's existing beliefs and systems of the world, right? Especially the economic challenging, right? So my question to you was, and I guess if you're opening up to conversation, but how do you feel about using the system that people already believe in as the anchor to subversively shift their thinking versus challenging them more directly?
Oh, I think we have to. You've got to meet people where they are, right? But then I think the challenge is it becomes a game of chess in many ways, that you can see your way to checkmate, but it's how you lead the witness through questioning, I think is the best way, and the way in which I find works. Yeah, it's hard without when people are so imbued in the capitalist system, anything else might be seen as socialist. And I've had this conversation with some friends in America, and if they get a sniff of this being a threat to their view of the capitalist system, then the conversation shuts down, and you get into the sort of tropes that you see around Trumpism and the like. And it's bloody frightening. But then, by the same token, as I do now, I make no apology for I want to deal with those people who want to make change. And if you don't want to make change, well, carry on. Be one of the 7 billion people out there who are going to fall off the edge of the cliff. But because in a finite world, there is a limit to exponential growth.
Thank you.
The other thing that I like to say is that one currency is economics, the other is energy. And how much does the dollars produced by your company cost in energy terms? And I bet they don't know, or if they do, they keep it quiet. And I would encourage people to actually make a point of how much energy they're using and where that energy comes from, and then challenge them to improve how they're using energy, because that's the planet's currency. And not changing their economic goals, but if they achieve their economic goals without doing harm to the planet, then that's an even better outcome. The other thing I would say is that, sorry, Michelle, I see you got your hand up. Thank you. And I'll finish on this comment, is point them to the Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Bank of England, He's now with the United Nations. But as governor, he said, those corporations who do not address climate change will go bankrupt. And then they go, well, that's not us. Well, you go, well, if it were, what is your time to extinction? My bet is you'll have an impact.
Thanks, Richard.
Michelle, g'day.
Hey, Richard. Wow, I've got to go back and listen to all the previous sessions now. That was great.
Thank you.
You know that my passion and my work is directed at the next level down, which is the human within all of this.
Yes, of course.
And what and you know, my passion is that we can get the humans to shift their anchor to be able to work within what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And I, where you had before, no connection, no care. And what struck me is that
Under the failures, yes.
Yes, is I thought the top one for me was also about no courage.
Oh,
and
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. You needed another C, Richard. And but I think the reason for that, we've got to understand, is actually quite primal, because when you work at those higher levels, and I'm doing a lot of work in education at the moment, and as we know, we've had NAPLAN, we've now got ATAR, which I think is a worse system, and the energy cost to humans in that system is enormous. And the energy cost, you talked about, you know, the cost of profit to energy, it's the energy of humans as well, right?
Yeah, right, absolutely.
But the reason we don't have the courage is because to work in that intangible, what was the word you used? Structurally
functionally indivisible.
Yes, is the fear of failure.
Yeah.
And the primitive brain will jump in and say, where will I be safe? And I'll be safe at that lower level. I'm not safe at the top level. And increasingly, for the reason you said, you know, with making the mistakes and being able to tolerate mistakes as long as we do something about them, because we don't have that tolerance, it plays into that primitive feeling of, well, right, I'm not going to put myself in an unsafe space. I'm going to stick to the data.
So in coaching CEOs, then that's where it starts, right? Because exactly. You've got to go to the top of the tree. And this goes to Liam's point, you know, around meet people where they are, right? You know, and it's about the fear of failure. But what if the boss shows that he's or she's got a fear of failure, but this is how we're dealing with it?
Yes.
And then, and this is something that I remember Hal Gregerson saying to me. Hal is the director of the Leadership Center at MIT Sloan. And Hal says that he goes out when he's mentoring CEOs and invites them to be deliberately wrong.
Yeah. Love it.
And then ask lots of questions. And, you know, if you subscribe to Hal's post, his latest book has all been about asking questions, is to actually demonstrate from the CEO that, yes, okay, you know, the future is unknown. That's level 9. That's 2 levels of complexity above, exponential levels of complexity above us as humans. Of course, we're going to get it wrong, right? So let's live with this, but then make sure that we've got the values that can deal with that. Hey?
Yeah, beautiful. And you know, I'll just leave you with kind of my favorite meme, which is all of this is normal human behavior, this avoidance, this challenge, this this lack of courage, but it's just not useful. And so in this day and age, we have to overcome that normal human avoidance and behavior and start to work with useful. And I love the idea of, you know, we've got to change the anchor, because that is the set point. Thank you.
Yeah, look, that was a great, and the previous one I did give the reference, or in fact, I think it was in this one. He was interviewed by a journalist for an article in The Observer. And in that article, Taylor was one of about 9 notaries asked what did they learn from Daniel Kahneman. But that's the one that really resonated with me most.
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah,
thank you, Richard.
super. Well, we've got all of 1 minute before time is up. Is anything from anyone else? Comments or farewells?
Hi, Richard, Steve. No, just to say, hi. No, look, some again, very, very, very useful and insightful presentation. Also, the follow-on discussion, and I always enjoy you sort of drawing on the research you've done and the thinkers that you've brought out. Also, it's been very good.
Yeah, and I'm particularly enamored by these thinkers from, you know, Balding wrote that article 1 year after I was born. And this is one thing to say for all of us that may, you know, don't attack the boomers for the state we're in. And yes, there's a lot that, you know, we could have done better. But one of the things that has happened in the last 80 years is the whole building of a new science, of systems science, that is helping fix today's problems. It's just that it's not central to everything that we do in the management tuition. Doctors don't get to be doctors without understanding the human system first. Then they're given the license to intervene. Managers can come up as financiers or human resource people and then suddenly are given a 10,000 person organization to manage, and they've got zero, by and large, deep general training in systems science. And we wonder why executives are getting burnt out and people are getting disengaged. There we are. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your joining us today. And the next one will be in 2 weeks' time. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.